Right, hello. Today we're going to be talking about public debt and GDP, public debt to GDP ratio, and whether a budget deficit is a problem for an economy. This is a really current question given the pandemic, given everything that's happened in the last 2 years. The past paper question is on Japan and its budget deficit, but we're going to write this question on the UK and what the impact is of the large fiscal deficit and national debt of the UK. To start the essay off, it's really important. I mean, you can't write this essay if you don't know what a fiscal deficit is. So fiscal deficit, absolutely essential to define straight away, where our government spending is greater than our tax revenue in a given year. Now, you can think of this at the beginning to make it easier for you as being like expansionary fiscal policy, where you have lower tax or higher government spending, creating the fiscal deficit. If you start at that point, this essay becomes easier. And we're going to want to, the structure of this essay is really hard, I think, to get clear. So we're going to consider growth, inflation, and long-run debt. We're going to divide that long-run debt into tax and spending in the future. What you might want to do now is to pause the video on these points, things that I've listed out, things that you might want to include. And then once you've done that, you can have a look around at some of this application data. We've got the UK debt as a percentage of national income over here. We've got debt in cash terms. You can see big increases there. Total public spending during this year here. What was spent on in 2021, that 300 billion, what was that spent on? I think that's very important to answer the question. The UK government debt interest, really increasing very high up there. Total debt interest in 2022 at 83 billion or 5.2%, £1,900 per household. So very large amounts of money there. And interestingly as well, relative to tax revenues, government's debt interest costs are at 320-year low. And this is the crux of the question. Well, what is the effect of that 323 billion pounds of the borrowing we've got there in 2021, and was it worth it? So pause your video, have a look at all those through all those things and think carefully about that. Now you've come back. First thing in all essays is to try and find a good diagram. So we'll go straight into a growth diagram and treat this like expansionary fiscal policy. So first point I think should be growth. You're going to get short-run growth as government spending is greater than tax revenue, and AD is therefore shifting out to the right. We want to give some examples there from the application of what was spent on as a result. We also want to say that factors of production have been improved, so perhaps spending on the NHS, spending on businesses, allowing them to invest, or spending on businesses so that they were not going bankrupt, which would then have a negative impact on capital. As capital is wasted, firms lose their productive capacity, and therefore LRAS would have shifted left. So these are all good impacts, shifting LRAS to the right, AD to the right, and we can then talk about RNO, Y1, YFE, YFE2. You might want to add in that it could have caused demand pull inflation in the short run, but in the long run, it is likely to have created growth. And so this is the positive argument that we should be spending on our economy, particularly in the pandemic, where things like government spending on vaccines may have had a very significant impact on the economy. Evaluation, we could put it down there, inflation, and you could have a nice short run versus long run argument there and say, well, in the short run, it's likely to be inflationary. Why not go back to the greater than 10% inflation rate in the UK in 2022-3? That's a negative effect of partially this government spending and expansion. Now, you could talk about crowding out, and I know this is a theory that many don't like very much, but you might have talked about the demand for loanable funds shifting to the left, to the right, as the government issues bonds and raises the equilibrium interest rate from R1 to R2. That's the interest rate on the y-axis there, percentage. That's a possibility, and if that makes sense, it's quite nice, because that would mean that AD interest rate goes up, and then AD then shifts back to the left. So you could argue that the growth caused is less significant, but perhaps an inflation argument would be more applied. There's certainly a time lag involved as well. There's certainly a time lag involved as well, so you might want to talk about that too. And particularly with things, but then again, if you look at the actual things that the government was spending on here, many of them had pretty quick turnarounds, like we found the vaccine pretty quickly, for example. So you could actually link that to specific policies and say how long that time lag was. So there's a lot of debate there, a lot of things, a lot of this information can be brought into those arguments. Point 2, so effect on future tax revenue. Well, all of this spending will affect profits, incomes in the future. And specifically, if we're going to think of the pandemic, the spending on vaccines, the spending on keeping businesses afloat, not letting them go bankrupt, for example, the furlough scheme, all of those things would enable businesses to recover more quickly. It allows us to come out of lockdown more quickly, and that results in LRES shifting to the right. As we said above, there was this growth, and compared to had we not done it, our incomes and our profits will be a lot higher than had we not spent that money. And we're talking about incomes and profits in the year afterwards, so quite quickly. Income tax revenue and corporation tax revenue would therefore rise. Remember that they are taken as a percentage of income and a percentage of profits. Incomes and profits are much higher given that the government spent this money than they would have been otherwise, allowing us to collect tax in 2023, 2024, 5 at a much greater amount than we would have done otherwise. And therefore the budget deficits in these years, say 2022 to 2030, for example, would be much smaller, or they may even move into surplus had they not otherwise have spent that money compared to that situation. And we could then show our knowledge of public debt by saying, well, if we have a budget surplus, we can pay back or reduce the debt, pay back some of our debt in the future, which may have a positive effect on the overall level of public debt. There's a nice evaluation here, and I think you could really bring in the idea of government failure and the types of expenditure. So what type of spending was this 323 billion? What was it spent on? And if you want to look at that, you can in this graph here. And we can see that there's social spending, public services, healthcare, support for individuals, and support for businesses. I'd argue that support for businesses is pretty important. So we have capital expenditure, current expenditure, and transfer payments. If they are transfer payments, they may not have long-run effects on our growth, and therefore our growth rates in the next 5 years may not have a significant difference. If there's not a significant difference between what they would otherwise be, then our tax revenues would either go up or stay the same. It depends on which type of expenditure is, and it's the capital expenditure that is particularly useful. Now, spending to firms ensures that if they were to reinvest that money into capital, that might have that effect. Clearly, spending on health services, for example, is going to have significant impacts on the quantity and quality of labour, and so that may well have had a beneficial effect. Lack of information. Well, we may not have known how serious the pandemic was going to be, and perhaps we spent too much money. Perhaps the pandemic wasn't as serious and wouldn't have had such a serious effects as we would otherwise known. So you can really get into a debate about whether the government knew what the optimal amount was to spend and whether it would save that money in the future or not. And finally, you could look at corruption or time delays, or we had all the issue with PPE, personal protective equipment, and the fact that that was procured from suppliers which may not have been reputable and wasn't possibly very useful, and we actually had lots of PPE which we couldn't use. So there's lots and lots of arguments there about whether our spending did actually have future impacts on our tax revenue, enable us to grow our economy compared to if we hadn't have done so. Finally, we can talk about the effect on future interest repayments and future spending. And remember that future spending, a lot of our spending is on interest repayments, so those two things link. So we know that debt results in interest repayments. You can link back to some and quote some of these statistics here. For example, the debt in cash terms is now up at look at that, over 2.5 trillion, and as a percentage of national income we're looking at around about 100%. That then raises a question, well, how much or how reliable is the UK government? And you can see this increase in the debt interest, central government debt interest as a percentage of GDP is rising. That partially is because of having more debt to service, but also partially because now the UK is having to spend has higher interest rates because their credit rating is lower. Okay, and it may well be that as higher debt, we are less confident in the UK economy. So debt results in interest repayments, and in the UK, we've seen statistics of over 5%, 6.1%. Was the figure that I saw of the budget spent on interest. We've got large opportunity costs. We've got higher borrowing in the future because we're going to have to borrow in order to pay this back, this interest back. Remember, when we're paying interest, we're not paying back the actual debt. We're just paying back the cost of that borrowing. That might mean that we have to cut public services in the future. It might mean that we have to then borrow to pay it back, and then that might increase the future public debt again. So all of these things are a real problem, and it's a problem for future generations. And there is a nice phrase called intergenerational equity, where you could argue that this is not fair for the next generation if they're having to pay back our debts. Evaluation. Well, it depends on whether your credit rating is going down. We know now that the UK government's credit rating, I think, is AA. It's gone down from AAA, and that might mean that you have higher interest rates. World interest rates are very important. We know that world interest rates have risen, and so as they are higher, you're going to have to spend more to deal with your debt. And this debt becomes so much of a bigger problem in the future if world interest rates rise. If your very nice point is if your debt is dollar denominated and you have a different currency and you have a depreciation, then that might mean that the local currency value of your debt could rise as well. So that's a big problem for developing countries and something that you might want to talk about. Ultimately, in judgment, it all just depends on the type of debt that you took on to begin with. If the type of debt was good, you had returns on capital projects which were high. If the debt was sustainable, then it's okay. And generally, if our GDP to debt ratio is not rising, then it should be okay. Our debt could be going up, but if our economy is growing at the same time, then we will be able to pay back the future debts using our the increased size of our economy. The second thing it depends on is the interest rate. And you may argue against that and say ultimately world interest rates are going up, in which case that then becomes much bigger, much more